Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Guess. I'm an affiliated faculty with CITP, and it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Munger, who's a visiting research scholar at CITP for the year. He's otherwise assistant professor of political and data science at Penn State. We're partners in crime at the Journal of Quantitative Description Digital Media, which is an open access journal that we co-founded more than 2 years ago with former CITP fellow Esther Hargitay, who will be actually speaking here in a couple of weeks. So, all right, I'll not make this too long. I just want to list a few of the topics Kevin has studied quantitatively in the past few years. Twitter bots, streaming chats, TikTok, clickbait, and deepfakes. I mentioned bots. Okay, so for each topic, Kevin was on the case long before other researchers. But I want to give the impression that Kevin is sort of always looking for the next shiny object. Quite the contrary, he's been methodically building a general theory of digital media, and he's using it to give us insight into novel instantiations of it, as I'm sure we'll hear about today. Many of us here probably come from the perspective that we're all embedded in technosocial systems, but one of the running themes of Kevin's work, at least as I understand it, is to remind us that while humans are constantly shaping how they respond to new technologies, those technologies are also shaping us, including which capabilities we can develop and what skills and literacies will be rewarded in society in the future. So that's what we learned from a somewhat historical perspective in Kevin's recent book, Generation Gap, which you should all check out. And I'm going to just plug another couple of projects before letting Kevin begin. So possibly of interest to some of you, he and Nate Matias worked to make available an entire archive of the results of A/B tests, which were conducted by Upworthy, which you may or may not recall, as it was trying to game the Facebook algorithm and win the clickbait arms race. There's already some fascinating research making use of this, such as a recent article which found that the most engaging headlines during this time were ones that made identities salient. So super interesting research. And if you aren't already, you should all check out his Substack, Never Meta Science, which is full of musings about temporal validity, cybernetics, and tech policy. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, Andy. Happy to be here and looking forward to talking about chatbots for good and evil. So the title for this talk comes from having observed a lot of interest in the application of tech for good. And as Andy's very kind introduction pointed out, I have been thinking about the ways in which these technologies are not just one shot. They don't simply have immediate effects that are either good or bad, but fundamentally reshape society and what it even means to be human. So I'll begin by reflecting on 20 years of social media. So Facebook was founded in 2004. It's been about 20 years as a going concern here, which is somewhat sobering. And if y'all recall, or perhaps not, in some of your cases, the pitch was, here's new free digital media technology. Right? That's what happened. There's all these new tech companies saying, here's some new free digital technology. And I think after 20 years, we can ask fairly broadly, how did that go? Right? And I mean, I think this is quite serious. I mean, it went a lot of ways. But what's most interesting to me from a tech policy perspective is how could it have gone, right? So how could what could have been different, right? And specifically, when could the relevant actors have known all of these things, right? So I'm going to be talking today about our status in society as academic researchers. At CITP, we try to make more connections to policymakers. There are many other types of actors who have been involved in the creation of social media and how it is used in society. And so thinking through these past 20 years, who could have learned what social media was doing? How could that knowledge, and then the ultimate political question of how to apply it, have filtered through society? So the issue here is that it changed everything. I mean, I at least accept the premise that all war, politics, journalism, academia, society, business, education have been dramatically changed by social media. And so none of these entities in society are unmoved movers from which we could have observed what was happening in social media and then immediately decided how we could have changed things. So, I mean, it's a hard problem, right? But I think that now we have, over the past year in particular, this emergence of LLMs and specifically ChatGPT. And so I'll use these technologies somewhat interchangeably because they do seem to have intersected in a accelerating way over the past year. And we have the premise of tech companies saying, here's some free new digital technology. So it seems like now is a good time to be thinking about how this might go and how we might want it to go. So the question I'll be exploring today is how should we decide whether to use chatbots? This is immediately a higher level of abstraction than just the immediate question of should we use chatbots, but how should we decide? And I mean, seriously, how, yeah, please.
Who's we?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I'm going to be focusing mostly on academics and our role within the larger structure of, I think we have a non-trivial role. So my comments were mostly focused on what we should be doing, academics. It's sort of the community that I am imagining I'm speaking to mostly here. But then more broadly, right? So I'll get to this, right? So philosophically, like what are the fundamental philosophical questions at play here? Epistemologically, how can we learn this? How can other actors learn this? How can that knowledge circulate in society? And then, of course, politically, which is the ultimate question. I mean, in a democratic society, we have some idea that collectively the citizens of the society should be deciding what happens. But then specifically, our politics involves questions of legality. So, I mean, I think all of these systems intersect, and I can't hope to really speak too far beyond what academics hope to achieve, but having this conversation with an eye towards thinking about how our role intersects with the roles of these other institutions. Thank you. Great. So that sounds somewhat pessimistic, and this is a quote from McLuhan, which I actually am including to assign a note of optimism. I do feel that there is some pessimism or even fatalism about the way in which chatbots, generative text is going to happen. That is absolutely going to happen, that we have no real say in the matter. Perhaps like we could have like small tweaks to how it's applied, but the technology is here and it will be used. And I think that pessimism is not, it's not generative, it's not helpful. So I like McLuhan's quote here, that if there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening, we can actually intervene in the system. I mean, especially now more so than 5 years down the line, thinking back to the social media case. This also speaks to the sort of role I'll be playing in this talk, which is not primarily as a scientific role where I'll be testing hypotheses, but this more generative and even poetic thinking, rethinking how these technologies intersect with how we think about society. All right, so I'll be talking about how chatbots affect society on a number of levels. The first, by investigating what does it actually mean to read and write. I think these technologies have been foundational to education, but even the technology of liberalism and democracy, and that generative text actually forces us to rethink all of these. I'll be thinking about investigating my specific study with chatbots and asking about how we could use chatbots in as academics to learn for good, perhaps, and then investigating exactly what good is being done when we use the standard models of chatbots or doing research that I think most of us inhabit. I'll talk about data science as a simulation and think about how this is sort of a simulated reality and how this actually intersects with the reality writ large. And then discuss ethics, as I expect any talk like this would necessarily have a conversation about ethics. But I'm going to take it one step further and talk about morality as well. So I think that this distinction speaks to these much more fundamental questions about our values and even what it means to be human as technology is changing so dramatically. All right, so the first premise, which has come out of my normal science academic research, is that the regulatory apparatus and all of these intersecting systems of academic research, the law, electoral democracy, education, all of these systems which we have in place, which govern society, govern kind of broadly, cannot function given the contemporary rate of technological change. So we all know how difficult it is to generate academic knowledge or even journalistic knowledge, and how much harder it has been to keep up with these topics of late. And I think that the first step of simply generating this knowledge is not enough. It also has to filter throughout society and then redound ultimately to education. Right? And so I think that the way in which social media has intersected and revolutionized big parts of society without, for example, our primary, secondary, and tertiary education fully adapting to it means that the broad regulatory apparatus of society cannot keep up with this rate of change. So for us to meaningfully be able to decide what to do vis-a-vis these things, I think we first need to slow them down. And the second overarching theme is going to be a kind of theoretical inversion. I find this very helpful whenever there's some kind of anxiety about machines becoming human-like. I think this ultimately reveals that humans have already become machine-like. So to the extent to which humans can be replaced by machines, this is because the role of those humans in society has already been reduced to somewhat of a machine. All right, so getting into this first question of how the chatbot's generative text changes what it means to read and write, I'll be talking about information inflation and intentionality. So a framework that's common in game theory, but also a lot of signal processing in CS is, you're probably familiar with this, costly signaling. The basic idea is that the informational content encoded in a message is commensurate with the cost how much it costs to send that message. Right? So the ability to send a costly signal makes it a credible message. As the cost of sending signals goes to zero, the informational content of those messages also goes to zero. So this wouldn't necessarily be a problem well, it might be a problem, but most of the way in which game theorists think about these questions of costly signaling and these signaling models has to do with equilibrium. So there's a shock, right? We might have a shock which lowers the cost of sending messages, but as long as everyone is aware that that shock has happened, they can sufficiently discount the messages that are now very cheap to send. And I think the problem is that technology, as it intersects with society, it creates disequilibrium. And so different actors in society are more or less aware of this shock. So the people at the cutting edge of technology might be aware that, for example, it's very easy to automate sending emails. And so we all know that if you get an email and there's not any cost associated with it, the informational content is very low. But that fact that there has been a shock to the cost of sending signals is not equally distributed. And so this creates disequilibrium where certain actors in society are less aware of the cost of sending these signals. I think this intersects with my previous work on generations because of the reality of the human life cycle. So although there has been accelerating change in communication technology over the past decades, we still live roughly the same length of time, ideally, 80 to 100 years. Right? And so there are many people who were born and raised in a very different technological environment. And there's this basic learning parameter where when we're young, we learn how to learn. We learn how much we should be learning from different types of signals. And you can think of this in a Bayesian perspective or from a cognitive psychology, but regardless, as people age, this fundamental learning parameter about the amount of information contained in signals remains somewhat static. And so older people are less able to update to these kind of shocks, which reinforces this problem of disequilibrium. Yeah.
I was going to ask the disequilibrium. First of all, is it okay to ask as we go?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. The second is the disequilibrium issue. Are you assuming that there was equilibrium before these chatbots, or is disequilibrium just constant?
I mean, I think disequilibrium is constant, but I think that the variance in people's understanding increases as the rate of technological change increases. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think it's especially bad right now because American society is, for historical reasons, disproportionately run by older people. And so this intersection of what I call boomer ballast and accelerating technological change, I think produces this tension and exacerbates it anyway. Thank you. Another way to think about this is that digital media is alien. It's as if some force came and invaded society and changed something as fundamental as the gravitational constant. Right? So we all learn basically just by living in the world how fast something falls to the ground. And if I see something fall faster than that gravitational constant, I think there must be something else, some other unobserved thing. But in fact, it's possible always as a Bayesian that gravity itself has changed. And so I think that the magnitude and the speed of technological change implied by digital media is akin to aliens coming and changing the gravitational constant. That's how disconcerting it is for these social structures, and specifically people who are raised in a different context. So the question I'm trying to get at, and this is very broad and philosophical, is why do humans communicate? We have in social science some kind of answers, but I'm going to begin with my favorite existentialist media theorist. And we'll do a little bit of media theory in this talk. If you do too much, you start wearing a second pair of glasses on your head. Right, this is Willem Plusser. He says, communication is an artificial, intentional, dialogic, collective act of freedom, aiming at creating codes that help us forget our inevitable death. So you see the existentialism here. It's a lot to unpack, but the two components of this definition that I'm interested in is first this intentionality component. And so I think this is intrinsically related to our goals as humans when we communicate, and is a problem when we have this information inflation. And the second is freedom. And so this is a fundamentally normative or moral commitment that I will get to near the end of the talk. So this is both a positive and a normative description of why humans are communicating. All right, but as social scientists, we might expect answers more like to ask for help, right? So the evolutionary psychologists might be able to answer questions like, oh, we communicate to ask for help. We want to acquire information. We want to signal group allegiance, or things like to gain social status. These are sociological descriptions of why people communicate, but I want to get more concrete and tie this into the question of why do we communicate via text? Right? So we all communicate via text. It's we didn't always used to. This is a contingent technology, but it does permeate contemporary society in the past few centuries of Western society ever since the printing press. So one of the questions I want to ask is, why do people tweet? And when I used to tweet, and when I tweeted, I have to say that the answer for me was to get notifications. The primary reason to tweet is to get feedback. And so this already tells us that when we are tweeting, we are doing so within this technology of Twitter, and then it changes what it means to be writing messages to people, right? And so we can ask the same kind of question about why do people send messages on dating apps. We have some ultimate goal, but the proximate goal is, again, to get responses, right? So when we are in these systems, the way in which they gamify things and give us immediate numeric feedback on if we're succeeding or not kind of dominates the ultimate goal. We can also apply this to ourselves. Why do we write conference papers? When we tell ourselves it's to produce knowledge, but it's also to get citations, right? So all of these kinds of textual communication, which are very common today, come with them a kind of quantitative feedback, and they're embedded in systems in which you're being evaluated quantitatively and objectively, or at least publicly. And so I'm going to argue that this last question is a bit different. Why do people wish each other happy birthday? And so there's some sense in which the goal of wishing someone happy birthday is to say, I care about you. I spent enough time to think about you. You are now aware that I'm thinking of you. There's not really any informational content here, except it's a costly signal that I have spent time thinking about you. So here is an app which will automatically send happy birthday wall posts, right? So the idea of Facebook telling everybody that it's so-and-so's birthday obviously produced a shock to everyone getting birthday messages on Facebook. But even that might have been too costly. And so here's a service which, a digital technology company says, here's a free thing, which will even automate that. So it actually costs zero efforts to wish someone happy birthday. Right? And so what this means, this decreased cost of sending the signal actually eliminates the usefulness of this signal. And so the sentiment becomes happy birthday to one of the few people whose birthday I can remember without a Facebook reminder. Right? So sending someone a message on Facebook, happy birthday, has now become meaningless because the cost of doing so is 0. So the human intentionality, which was encoded in that, is evacuated. Yeah.
Why do you think it's meaningless?
I mean, because the receiver can't know if you actually encoded, if it was intentional or not.
Do you think people think it's meaningless?
So this is the disequilibrium question, right? In equilibrium, it should be meaningless. I think you're right that people do, because there is this technological disequilibrium, and people, even if it was an automatic birthday message, they might say, oh, well. But one question we might ask is, are they being deceived? Is this emotional fraud or not? If there's an automatic post wishing someone happy birthday.
I think that the maintenance of social ties via these sort of highly, what's the word I'm looking for, ritualized messages, even if it's set up automatically, still serves a social function. It's not about necessarily a cybernetic model of communicating a piece of information, right? It's about, say, it's like Christmas cards.
Well, but Christmas cards are costly still in some sense. There's not cost less. And I guess the argument is that if everyone really understood that it was actually automated, it would cease to be. Like when my doctor says happy birthday to me, it is meaningless.
All right, that's a great example. Yeah, I understand that. Okay.
Yeah, great. Okay. So please, so yes.
But costly, think about costly signals, it's not just the unit cost of sending a signal, which I agree on Facebook is very low for happy birthday. So for example, next time Biden tweets, which will be this afternoon at some point, right? If you want, I wouldn't suggest you do this. Write a death threat in your own name in Twitter as a response and find out what happens, right? That's very cheap for you to do, cost you 0 time and cost. But that's not a cheap signal. FBI will come to your house and interview you about why you did it, and it will sort of derail your life for the next few weeks. And that's just, if you want, when you get on email, sending emails very cheap. Write to the dean of, Penn State, and write something just very offensive, which is, out of contract, or make a comment about any political event, and sort of see what happens, right? So that's, when you talk about things being cheap, I want to understand what you mean by that. That's a very precise term in game theory, and it seems it's being used with some imprecision here.
Well, so the time cost is one component of the cost.
Yeah.
But there are other systems which can impose costs as well, like legal systems, or in the case of the dean, reputation.
Yeah.
Right? So as long as people have reputations, it's never fully costless. And so we could think, actually, if someone was revealed to be doing this, they could incur a cost. Right. So this is just the one component of the cost is the marginal effort, and that is what I'm getting at here. But there are other structures which impose costs, which I'm not going to zero.
Okay, well, I'll reserve judgment. So I just have a feeling where this is going is saying that, LLMs are producing text with sort of no cost or consequence for anyone, but they do have cost and consequence.
Yeah, no, like yes, yeah, that's fair. All right, so to the chatbots, I did this experiment 8 years ago now, and it's a helpful for me at least to revisit this and think about how it helped academics learn about social media, which is the analogy that I'll be using for how academics should be thinking about learning about LLMs and chatbots. So this is an experiment I did on Twitter to reduce racist harassment. Very simple. The sample was white male Twitter users in 2015. I sent them messages with bots. These were like sock puppets. I just copied and pasted the same message. The treatment variation was the status and group identity of my bots. We'll dwell on this. It's just helpful. These are what I did. I just changed the way the bots looked. I changed their name in the classic, I forget the econ paper, Molly Nathan, I think, to have them signal white or black identity. And so this is what varied in the experiment. And this is the actual treatment here. Someone used a racial slur, and my bot responded with this canned message. Very simple. This is a very, very simple kind of chatbot, which I do think is helpful for thinking, like controlling as much as we can for what we could learn if we were to use chatbots for good. I've already seen proposals to automate this kind of counter speech. I've seen people trying to use generative text on Twitter to automate this kind of counter speech. Yes.
So, for example, the little message when you share an article on Twitter that's like, have you read this article?
Mhm.
You like to read this article.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a system cue, right? And so that's coming from Facebook. No one thinks that costs Twitter No one's actually typing that out,
Yeah.
right? But there is in this sense, some sense that someone was typing this out.
Got it.
And that's a big part of it, right? Like
Uh-huh.
there is the belief that first of all, I'm being observed, my behavior is being observed, and that someone else is observing it and is typing this out and is responding as a person,
Mhm.
right? And so that's where the leverage comes from. And if someone thought this were a bot, the response, or if it was not authentic, the response might have been different. Okay, so what exactly did we learn? And so we'll be talking about like the way in which the knowledge that was generated from this study is then going to be incorporated into these other systems in society to think about how this actually works. And to really take this to the highest level, what is the goal of social science, right? So there's two competing schools. One says that we're trying to explain behavior, one that we're trying to predict behavior. And we'll talk about both of those. The real goal, of course, is to produce academic papers. Bruno Tour proves this. So it's a bit glib, but I actually think it's not incidental. So actually what's going to happen is that there is some behavior that happens in the world. And then because our goal is to produce academic papers and books and conference proceedings, it has to be projected down into the much lower dimensional space of human language encoded theory. So the fact that the artifacts that we produce to store the knowledge that we produce is text means that in order to summarize what happens, it means that I had all of these bots do all these things, I then have to project this down into natural language theory, right? Which is how papers, like that's the form of the medium of papers and books. And then we might do a number of these studies and then try to synthesize them, aggregate this knowledge. So this is a kind of, we're doing some operation in this lower dimensional theory space with the goal ultimately of projecting this high dimensional space back up into the high dimensional space of social reality. So we've learned something from doing these studies. And then this will hopefully help us explain behavior and then predict what would happen if we did something else. So what exactly did we learn? Yes.
Is there any reason why you can't encode theory like in symbols or logic in which you could capture higher dimensions of reality? I mean, some people are doing that.
Yeah, I think
already,
that's a useful way to think about it. And so I think that I'll talk about, data science is trying to avoid this detour through human encoded knowledge. I think this has its own problems, but at present, you do still have to produce papers. And that's the sociological reality of doing academic research. So that might be a helpful way forward, but that would be a pretty significant change from how we do things now. So the question I want to ask is, what exactly did we learn from this study? Social pressure exists. So the findings of the study are commensurate with the idea that social pressure exists. I don't think anything that I found could have disproven this. Right? There's no result of the study which would have said social pressure does not exist. Social pressure from higher status in-group members is more effective. That's kind of how it's summarized. Again, I don't really think that those words could have been falsified. That's sort of what high status in-group members mean. We might have, if we didn't find this in the way that I operationalized the variables, we might have said, well, you just didn't do it right. Because there's no way that social pressure from high status in-group members is not more effective. That's just what those words mean. I'm very confident that we learned this, that the accounts that were treated by bot C sent a few hundred fewer racial slurs in October 2015 than the accounts that did not get treated by any bot. But that's for sure. But how does that help us in any way? Like, there's some sense in which this has to be connected to a more generalizable theory for the knowledge to be useful. And then the way it's sort of in the theoretical model that I tested, this social identity, the individuation effects model, what we can say is that this model applies in this context, right? So the model exists. It's been shown to apply in some contexts. We couldn't ever falsify that this model exists. We can falsify or support the idea that it is excellent and active in this context. So that's, I think, how most theoretical work proceeds. Yes.
What is the side model?
It's the social identity model of de-individuation effects. It has to do with anonymity online. But it's a kind of social psychological theory that I was testing in the paper. And I think in general, these kind of behavioral experiments are connected to a theory like this. So the theories are not like this, they're not like this, but there's some kind of theoretical model that exists in the literature that you can show support for in this context or show does not apply in this context. Amen.
So I really like that paper, and I haven't read it in a long time, but would you say you were really testing that theory, or would you say you were testing a specific intervention?
Well, paper says I was testing that theory.
I know, but I'm asking you. I know the sociology of what has to go into papers. I'm asking you what you think you're doing.
The theory was suggested by a reviewer.
Okay, so
Hashtag overly honest methods.
I mean, right. I was a grad student, very enamored of experiments. I wanted to do an experiment.
Yeah.
It was cool. That's it's kind of a different paradigm. I
Yep.
think that, right. So, but we can talk about that paradigm, and I will in just a second. Right. So I think that the problem I'm getting at here is that there are just simply too many contexts. When natural science, the model that social science has evolved out of, we've really taken a lot of the same methods and institutions from natural science. The problem is social science is simply too high dimensional, and that it changes over time, right? So the context of Twitter in 2015, we can learn about that context, but it no longer exists, right? And so that doesn't actually help us, as opposed to some philosophers of science would disagree, but I think it's helpful to say natural science, physics, is constant across time and space. And so there are not a infinite number of contexts about which we might need to learn.
Is that
Yes.
right? I mean, what's the theory of evolution when there's nothing that's alive on Earth? Prior to life existing on Earth, what does it mean to have a theory of evolution? There are times that it applies, times it doesn't.
Sure, so physics is the most immortal, and then there's just a continuum of, but biological, so evolution though is not changing. I think it's actually helpful to parameterize the problem that I'm describing, which is that the faster the phenomena is changing vis-a-vis our ability to act in the world, the bigger these problems are.
I agree with that. And it makes theories redundant more quickly and all that sort of thing. But I guess it's not obvious to me that means there's no place for theory.
Oh, right, sure. I think theory is absolutely necessary. I'm going to get at the other perspective. I think is worse. But I think that it does mean that we need to. I mean, the things that I'm describing as having happened, I believe, are sort of, as Matt suggests, like, that's how we all think about what we're doing. And I'm trying to problematize them in the context of these rapidly changing technologies that I think in order for the knowledge we produce to be useful, that has to be applied at a relatively rapid pace.
Yeah, I think I'll probably agree with that. Yeah. Thank you.
So one of the issues, I think, again, getting back to this technology of the written word as the medium in which we encode our knowledge, is the idea of citational practices and the mapping between words and social phenomena. So an example that I often use is that, let's say that there was a Facebook desistance study, perfectly executed RCT, cost a few $1 million. 2015 finds that using Facebook increases political knowledge, but the same study, where we pay people to stop using Facebook, finds the opposite. Future research will adjudicate which is correct. So that's the paradigm of that we're all working in. We're going to figure out which is conflicting results. We'll do it again, and we'll find out which is right. I think that doesn't make any sense. Like Facebook in 2015 is the same word as Facebook in 2022, but it actually maps to radically different everything. What Facebook is, who uses it, how it intersects with the rest of society is very different. So the idea of accumulating knowledge with these permanent, like these citations, which are a permanent claim about knowledge, and that we can then tie them together, does not work here. All right, so let's say that you're not interested in theory. I think this is increasingly common. Well, we don't care about this woolly-headed theory. We're empirical data scientists. We just want to intervene, find out what happens, and then use that. Let's say we've generated some local valid knowledge. We've done the interventions. We found out what they did, and then we're not going to use theory to synthesize that knowledge. We're simply going to use a machine to synthesize that knowledge. So we have the paradigm of out-of-sample prediction. We have some machine learner. It's going to aggregate the previous knowledge generated over time. We might have some problems of concept drift or covariate domain shift. And these are well-known, well-studied problems downstairs here at Orphe in particular. But that's the paradigm here. And so I want to point out what I see as the problem here, and this will require a little bit more media theory. So I'll talk about Baudrillard's idea of simulation and the idea of data science as literally a science of data. That is, a science which takes as its phenomena of study data, not the world. Okay, so we can study simulations of social reality with data science. So human action on Twitter is already radically simpler than human action in general. The possibility space of what humans on Twitter can do is already radically lower than what humans in reality can do. So our job of intervening on, predicting on, explaining Twitter is actually significantly easier than explaining, predicting human action in general. And so I think, I mean, what people were excited about social media in the beginning, 2010s, was the idea of deliberation, like democratic deliberation. We're going to talk to each other and we're going to figure out what ideas are good and we're going to share knowledge and come to consensus. That's not what Twitter is. It is a deliberation themed video game, right? So getting back to the idea that the feedback is encoded in the architecture of the platform. User's goal is to get a high score without getting suspended or fired. To your point, right? Like it is a simulation, but you can have that intersect with reality in some way. It is possible to say something on Twitter which will get you fired or arrested, but the goal of Twitter is to get a high score without having these negative consequences. And so returning to this initial normative claim, Twitter is simple enough that chatbots can imitate humans. Right? The reason I was able to do that experiment was because it was possible to use accounts to simulate humans. That's not true yet in embodied reality. There are no chatbots here among us, or at least not that imitate humans successfully. So in order to, so yes, please.
I mean, is that, did you have a, I mean, I didn't read the original study. Did you have it seems like in order for that last statement to know that that's true, you're going to need to have a bot that claimed it was a bot.
So
right? You said that it was because people thought they were humans that you found that effect, right? But I think that there are lots of studies that show that in fact bots that say they are bots are still effective at doing things that humans do because they do other things that the communication is doing, right? So I mean, the question is that like, I mean, did that study have a bot that was like a treatment where the person was, I have no race, I am a bot? Or are there other studies that do this? Because it seems like, I don't know, I'm skeptical that we need to have the human there, or at least some of this thing. I mean, it seems possible that you could have a bot that claims it's a bot, talk people out of harassing people on. I mean, I think I've been talked out of doing things, not that thing, but other things by bots.
So yeah, I think that's right. I think that the message has contains lots of things. What I found was that there were significantly different effects if the bot that I was using appeared to be a white man or a black man. So there is some sense in which the identity of the sender does matter. I think you might still have gotten that effect with a bot. That's an empirical question. And on some things, you could have gotten an effect with the bot. I believe that. But this sort of requires us to disentangle what it means, or like all of the different mechanisms that go into receiving this signal. And I was going to argue in just a second here. Right, that also is kind of still the easy job because it's on Twitter, so it's already simplified. So, right, Baudrillard's simulation, famously the inspiration for the Matrix. So, in order to participate in the simulation, I had to jack myself into the Matrix, right? And this meant turning myself into a bot, right? So I've come to reevaluate. This is the specific procedure, the experimental procedure I followed, right? So I found tweets with the racial slur. I followed this algorithm to see if this was in fact within the scope of my study. So in order to interact in the simulation, I had to turn myself into a bot to some extent. I had to reduce the action space for the purposes of experimental control. So these are all the steps I followed in the experiment. And then, right, intervening in the simulation, you've seen this. Then there's learning within the simulation. So what we're learning is, this is the visualization of the output of a regression, which shows that the number of tweets sent by people who got messages from white bots with a large number of followers, the number of slurs went down compared to the control condition. Right. So this is within the simulation of Twitter, and indeed the simulation of the simulation of Twitter that I was setting up. And so, right, within this scope, we can learn about what's happening. Right. It's a relatively simplified context here. And so the way that data science operates, this empirical study of interventions and their effect on data, I think treats reality as a nuisance. So data science is good at easy problems. Normatively easy problem is to reduce the incidence of racial slurs on Twitter. That is per se good. This is sort of like axiomatic. So that's an easy task, normatively. But data science is actually inverting the relationship between social science and reality. So whereas social science, at least, is aiming to study reality, data science is creating a simulation of reality and then studying that thing. So we have as the goal some target variable, some metric, which is calculable within the simplified ontology of the simulation. And so what we're going to do is to improve this metric. Things sometimes break down, right? And we are forced to grapple with reality when it reasserts itself within the simulation. So if something changed about how Twitter worked, we would then have to go back and rethink how the simulation we set up maps back onto the social reality. When things are the same, when we're in this simulation and reality is not intersecting with it, it is totally fine to go about, have this simplified metric and do our best to optimize for it. But as the world is changing and as these simulations that we have set up are changing, sometimes reality does reassert itself within a simulation.
It's very interesting, but I'm trying to think about how, if it's something specific to data science or if it's something like mathematical modeling. Mathematical modeling is good at easy problems, but the world is complicated and we often study the model. So is it any simplification? Or is it specific? What is, data
right.
science?
So I think the irony of studying interventions and trying to be very concrete in what we're doing is that we're being concrete within this simulated world. And like the classic problem is everyone knows when you do any kind of simulation, mathematical modeling, computer simulation, that's not reality. But if you spend enough time and like the sociology of working within that space is sufficient, that it basically becomes reality. So I think that this is a problem for people as, let's say, a mathematical modeling community, an epistemic community, becomes more and more advanced. The distance from reality increases, right?
When you say it becomes reality, you mean for the people doing that work, not that it's actually changing reality.
Exactly. Yes. Right. And so thinking about how this intersects with ourselves, Baudrillard famously said that the Matrix is really the kind of film about the Matrix that the Matrix would have been able to produce. And I think that is what's happening with academic data science. So academic practice is also a simulation. Human action in academia is radically simpler than human action in general. So our outputs are mapped. We have papers, we have like nodes of people, we have citational networks, right? And so when we are acting in this system, it is also not of reality. It is a simulation of the social structure that we've produced. There's a recursive structure of the systems we study and the systems in which we are embedded. So I think one of the questions we have to ask in order to understand how to better learn about the systems that we're studying is who designed our system? And I think no one really designed it. I think it has been also affected by all of these technologies, including social media, including LLMs and chatbots. And so in order to actually keep our own house in order and think about our role within society more broadly, we should be checking to see how it's all going. So the idea that given how revolutionary these technologies are, we can continue to do the same things that we have been doing, to continue to produce papers, to continue to cite each other, to continue to have departments, the whole structure that we've inherited from a quite distant past in terms of communication technology. The idea that we can use those same institutions to study what I think of as radical communication technologies, I think is a mistake. And so I think that the first step, and why I've been focusing on academics within the larger regulatory apparatus of society, is that I think that we can think about how to get our own house in order to adapt to these technologies and then serve our role of generating knowledge, circulating it within society. All right. So LLMs, I think, are the clear example where previously people had been somewhat, changing a little bit with digital technologies. We've got open access journals on the internet now. It's a little bit different, but everything had been roughly the same. But LLMs in the spring, it seemed like really forced academics to grapple with communication technology in a way that we had not. There's a radical shock to the costliness of a signal of a string of text. Right? And this has caused quite a bit of consternation about how can we be sure that the texts that our students produce are authentic. And this all gets to the question of why are they producing those texts? Like, what is the point of producing those texts? It's not to communicate information. It has some pedagogical function, we think. And so if they are replaced by generated text, the pedagogical function that they were serving no longer is being served. Right? Students can generate papers with very little effort. And so I think that the reason why we are concerned about our students being replaced by robots is that our institutions, which have been increasingly rationalized over the past few decades, already treat students as robots. So there are other institutions of education in which LLMs would not pose a threat to how we interact with students. But in the present, and this might be less true of Princeton and almost anywhere in the world, but in many places, right, the number of students with which professors, faculty are interacting has gone up dramatically. The ways in which they interact have been through these online systems, Canvas, whatever, right? They've been increasingly rationalized. And so it's actually incredibly easy for us to think that our students could replace themselves with the robots without us being able to notice. And in line with my initial argument, I think this shows that how we have already been kind of roboticizing the students. Right. It's possible even that some of us have used written papers this way. And how will this interact with the regulatory system of peer review, these kind of things? I think it's a very serious problem. No one has a good answer for it yet, but I think we can think about it. And I think that in this case also, that's only possible because so much of the writing of the papers that we produce is rationalized, right? You're fitting it into a formula, you're just checking the boxes to make it look paper-like in order to pass the 1-0 bar of peer review, at which point it has become published. Okay, I think that there's not really a way to deal with LLMs if the actual question we're asking is how do we deal with LLMs while expending mental effort and changing as little as possible? That seems to be what institutions are actually asking. How do we not change anything and have this not just go away as a problem? I think that's going to work. I think, as I've been arguing within academia, on the research side, there also has to be institutional reforms that we think about what we're trying to accomplish and then how that can be accomplished given the technological reality. And the fundamental questions that I am thinking about in terms of this question of theory, prediction, the language in which the knowledge we produce is encoded, is where should the knowledge we produce be machine encoded? At what point can we avoid this detour through the expensive process of human language? And related, where do we want the humans to be in the loop? So we have these processes of conducting data science. We need humans in the loop at certain points. The way in which the institutions we've inherited have humans in the loop, I think is not always efficient. And these are the fundamental questions I think we need to ask in the contemporary era. All right. Turning to the ethics and morality section. I presented this talk at the Computational Linguistics Conference this summer. They had an ethics committee, right? So this is how they addressed ethics, right? The current treatment of ethics is bureaucratized and rationalized. Right? So there's a boxes that you can check to deal with ethics, right? There's a whole process by which this happens. I'm going to argue that IRBs and ethics sections are neither necessary nor sufficient to actually fulfill our ethical responsibility. Here's a quote of a paper I'll talk about in just a second. We are not aware of any laws or institutional review board policies prohibiting mistreating simulated agents at this time. And so there is no ethical prohibition against doing this, and therefore, we're going to do this. I think even that claiming that ethics has been addressed within a paper or a conference implies that ethics can be addressed within a paper, right? This radically reduces the scope of ethical responsibility. And I actually think, given our role in society, we have an ethical responsibility obligation to act. The current paradigm is, when we intervene, is to do no harm, right? That's how we think about what we're doing from the medical studies paradigm. Of course, in reality, this means incur no liability. We don't want to get sued. That's the main goal here. So from Nathan Matias's work, I've been inspired by this idea of the obligation to experiment. There's lots of people who have concerns about the ethics of experimentation. And I think he argues convincingly that we actually are obligated to experiment, to understand these systems and make sure that they're working well. And given the contemporary informational asymmetries produced by technological disequilibrium, many people cannot meaningfully consent. When we think about the terms of service on these platforms, that's supposed to be the way in which people consent. It doesn't actually mean consent. Right? So they cannot meaningfully consent. But many of them also cannot meaningfully opt out. So the way that social media, and I think chatbots now, are going to change society means someone cannot meaningfully opt not to use social media, at least in many different disciplines, industries. You sort of have to do it. So there's no sense in which you have the possibility of opting out of this. All right. So the final topic, and I'll be quick here, is morality. So this is the study I talked about earlier, which is the paper published in the Proceedings of Machine Learning, in which they replicated the Milgram shock experiment, famously one of the most unethical, immoral experiments in the history of psychological science, in which people were incentivized to think that they were shocking other people to the point of torture. Right? So what they were doing is torturing these chatbots. So from the kind of, I think utilitarian ethics goes in line with the way in which we think about harms and benefits. And I think that is simply inappropriate for this kind of question. That given the way I've been talking about epistemic humility, the difficulties that we have with knowing what these things will do, consequentialist utilitarianism is simply not up to the task epistemologically of knowing what these things will do, and that a kind of virtue ethics is necessary here. This means simply thinking, is this good or bad? Does this mean that we are becoming better humans or worse humans? And this does require specifying the virtues that we want, right? This means that we have to decide how we want society to be, when in fact, the standard within these spaces is a kind of technocratic depoliticization, the idea that if we just don't talk about our moral commitments, they're not there, and we're simply improving efficiency or preventing harm, something like that. I think this is tied into the idea of positivist nihilism, which is, unless we have done science about what Facebook does to the mental health of teen girls, for example, we do not have standing in society to say that Facebook is good or bad, that we need to have done science to produce knowledge in order to have positions about whether or not we think technology, how it should be used in society. And I think that that's all not been good in the case of social media. I think that we need more proactive responses, which basically require a different moral calculation, in addition to the institutional reforms I discussed earlier. And so finally, I think there's a virtuous cycle of collective action. So at present, no one knows what to do. We never regulated social media. We're currently debating reforming a portion of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. That's the frontier of social media regulation. We never regulated social media. And at present, no one really knows what to do about chatbots or LLMs, right? And so I do think that that is reinforcing this fatalism, this nihilism, that we collectively can do anything about this technology, that it's not simply being done to us, and the best we can hope for is to reduce the harm it does. And so I have a very, very specific proposal. Right, this is ChatGPT, and we've all seen this, right? And so one thing ChatGPT does is say, I. Right, so one way in which we could, I think, begin to kickstart this process of the virtuous cycle of collective action is, I think we can think about banning chatbots from referring to themselves as I. This would draw a sharp line between humans and bots, which is the moral commitment that I've been building towards. I think that passing any kind of law in this space would be helpful for actually getting lawyers to think about the specific technologies that go into regulating this kind of thing. And I don't think that there's a good argument for why we should have chatbots that pretend to be humans. I think this further erodes the intentionality that is encoded into human communication. And insofar as we think the goal of human communication is to communicate intentionality, to tell each other about ourselves, this makes that harder. So chatbots could still be used like an enhanced Wikipedia or an enhanced Google search. The information retrieval functions are totally fine, but this does draw a sharp line between humans and bots. And I think that is the solution to the technological anxiety of humans being replaced by bots. So thank you. Yes.
So that was great, thank you. Thing that came up in my mind was you talked about the cost of transmission and the cost of creation, but I wonder how you think about the cost of reception and interpretability. Something that I think about a lot, like in the journalism world, is nuance versus simple metrics. People want to read an article and tell you whether something's good or bad. When you do the research, you realize it's never that simple, and there's a constant battle with the editor of like, how do I kind of make this readable, interpretable, interesting to the person, while also providing enough, but making it short enough, they read it quickly and they'll actually read it, and but also providing enough nuance that it actually hits that gets the complexity. So I just wonder how you think about like because you mentioned metrics in the past and like as like one of the reductions and like complexity of like the reality and like so how do you think about communicating that those things?
This is a very hard problem. I do think that the role of metrics in journalism has been disastrous, but I think that the only answer to this question is having people be better at interpreting information. So better contemporary education is the easiest out ever, but absent that, it's unclear how to solve the problem. Yeah.
So I guess my counterpoint to the policy recommendation is just no, let's not do this. It doesn't matter. So basically, whatever you think, sort of the consequences of sort of LLMs being used for sort of real human problems, there's easily the magnitude of say using them to potentially misadvise people on some medical matter or something like this. This is much more severe than whether they use sort of personal first-person pronouns, right? And in general, what evidence do we have that this is a particularly harmful aspect of LLMs?
Right. So I mean, I think that is getting at the question of this, positivist nihilism, right? So I think that part of my claim is that we have to be able to act absent that evidence. I also really don't think this is the most important thing we could do.
Yeah.
But this gets to this point of a virtuous cycle of collective action, and the problem being this fatalism in which there has been no regulation, and thus we don't think it's really possible to do anything.
You could regulate it out. So I don't actually think so. States can do that. So states can say, particularly, they can just say you're not allowed. They must not answer like this, and and so on and so forth. Right? I think it's sort of a non-solution to a non-problem, basically. And I think that it's tinkering around the edges of what could be a very deep problem, but it's just very hard for me to believe this is some sort of profound issue of LLMs kind of taking over.
I think what I'm optimizing for is how, can we pass a law quickly? And I think that this was the one in which I think many people would have intuitions that this is good. That we, talking about the question of how do we want society to be, and then making the argument that we don't want bots to imitate humans because this dehumanizes us, is the argument that I'm making. I don't think in terms of the effects, dramatically lower than other things we can imagine, absolutely.
Do you feel the same about, say, Clippy on the old Microsoft? Can I help you? I am available to help you.
Sure.
And by extension, TVs sometimes refer to themselves as personal pronouns. Or, I am having trouble doing blah,
sure.
Blah, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was in this. I mean, I think that does help interpretability. I think, for example, people seem to like this.
Yes.
And so this is a kind of moral commitment that I think that is bad. And I think that what is a big problem in society is this kind of dehumanization. And the moral commitment that I have is that we should reserve this status for humans and not for technology. Okay. Anyway,
so at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned this question of like, what should we do? And I said, who are we?
Yeah.
And like you said, academics. And this, I know this isn't the whole part of your talk, but this feels like something that's not really what we, unless the argument is we as academics should be supporting this policy proposal. So how do you think about what we as academics should be doing?
Sure. I mean, I think the middle part of the talk is mostly about that.
Yeah. Okay. So then
reforming our institutions.
Okay. So then I have a follow-up question about that.
Yes.
So, reforming our what makes you think that we can? I guess, do you think LLMs are the last thing that's coming, or it's going to be something else afterwards? And do you think we can ever reform our institutions at the speed of these other things? It's not clear to me that we can succeed at that.
Well, but this is my premise, though, is that the regulatory apparatus of society cannot function with this rate of technological change. So, in fact,
so then we should try to do something that we're not going to be successful at doing.
As opposed to what?
try to do something we could successfully do. Like, this is a very practical suggestion. Like, I agree with you here. Like, this is something we could potentially do tomorrow. Whether it would have the effects, is it the most important problem?
Sure.
Unclear, but this seems very doable. Whereas we should like reimagine all of our academic institutions, and we should be doing that constantly. That feels like pretty hard and not likely to be successful.
So, I mean, but that's yeah, please tell us.
Well, so I feel like what this whole talk was that we should, data science should have like normative commitments.
Yeah.
Right. And there's lots of fields that have strong normative commitments. In fact, most humanities fields have strong normative commitments, right? Like many critical race theory, post-colonial theory, science studies, feminist theory, like they all have strong normative commitments to things, right? There's plenty of fields who are able to produce knowledge. And there's people in qualitative social science, there's quantitative social sciences who have strong normative commitments. I don't know if it's about reimagining the entire fields of something like data science or computer science so much as it is maybe integrating learnings from other fields.
That seems much more doable than the kinds of changes I thought Kevin was implying.
I mean, I guess I do think that there are limits to what we are doing. Like, what are we doing if we're just producing papers and that they're citing things, and this is like as if it's permanent knowledge about something that's actually ephemeral. So should we just stop doing that entirely and become advocates? Maybe, actually not unreasonable, but that I don't see how it seems like bad faith to continue doing what we're doing if we don't think it works.
But to me, some of the reforms are happening within the system. So someone notes this inconsistent, like Facebook in 2015 is different than Facebook in 2022, and then they write a paper about temporal validity, and then that is a concept that then people adjust to over time if they think it's a really useful concept, which I think they will. And so I'm not saying that is happening as fast as the speed of technology, but like, it's not that the system never changes. And it's not that the system should change very, very quickly either. I don't think that's the right thing either.
Yeah.
If I may, I want to express kind of the opposite viewpoint.
Yes.
I think the silliness of writing papers as a way of, being part of the regulatory apparatus that you've talked about, I think the internet exposed that.
Yeah.
It's not exactly new with chatbots, and I think academia completely failed to adapt.
Yes.
It did nothing. I mean, not putting papers in archives, but ultimately didn't change much. So, if we haven't adapted in several decades, when the pace of change is accelerating, I feel that it's pretty hopeless. And I think maybe we should think about a regulatory system where academia doesn't have.
Yeah, Mika.
So, I mean, I guess that in terms of this particular suggestion, I wonder if you're giving people like enough credit. I think that the same time, around the same time you published your Twitter bot study, there was another Twitter bot study, which was trying to get people to, I forget, like participate in some sort of collective action project or whatever, right? And the model was one in which like that they were all, it was like everyone was bot, right?
Yeah.
They said they were bots,
Yeah.
right? Sure. It's not like you know the paper I'm talking about.
It's Andy wrote that.
We wrote that one.
If it's the one I think you're talking about, there's nothing to do with telling people we're bots.
Oh, we had a different study then.
Yeah,
This one,
okay.
I just looked it up. That
Yeah.
basically that was just the treatment. Everything was a bot, right? Like, so
Okay.
they said, and they had a little icon, they had a picture of a bot, and everyone was a bot.
Yeah.
And they got people to try to participate in anyway.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have like any feeling about whether this was a good study or a bad study or whatever, but I think the one thing that they found was that the least, like, basically every attempt to be persuasive was worse than just asking people to do it straight up. And their explanation is that people were already getting basically harassed on Twitter by so many bots trying to get them to do things, or in email and spam.
Right.
And basically all these things seemed spammy.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's the sense in which, like, I wonder whether I guess that this is maybe more towards the point about like the regular, like our ability as academics to do papers that influence policymakers, which then change these sorts of things right here. Aren't people like able to adapt? Aren't people adapting to this stuff in ways that are like, are there things that like we could do to maybe just like help or even understand the ways in which people are adapting to these things over time?
The one concrete example I have is a big 10% of donations to Trump in 2020 were returned because they were fraud. It was email fraud. People were signed up to make recurring donations. So I do think that fraud of all kinds is happening. I think informational fraud is the broad sense that I have, like, which is people misunderstand the informational content of a message. And so I do think that because a lot of people are not able to adapt, like there's a lot of older people in society who are not able to adapt. They're not embedded in networks of people who know how to adapt, and there's just no mechanism by which they adapt. So some people can, I think some people can't, and that's a problem. So this is
It's sort of like this example right here.
Yeah.
Like, I can see that it's ChatGPT, right?
Yeah.
Even if you happen to forget it, it's every third message. It's reminding you, I'm ChatGPT, like large language model generated by, like I think that like we know in this case, right? This is like the least problematic, like in some sense, right? It's doing everything it can to remind you that you're in the simulation.
Yeah.
And I just add to that the risk with that then becomes that if you only solve the easy solvable problems, then it gives a lot of talking points to the companies or whoever the people are saying, we're doing what you asked, which is the easy thing to do. And while the other problem is hard and not easy to solve, it's really important because they make an attempt towards that, and something that's an easy fix makes that a harder kind of harder to advocate for the messier situation.
Great. I mean, so yes, none of us know what's going to happen, and I think we still have to act without knowing what's going to happen. So thank you all for having these. What I wanted to use the space for was to have a broad conversation. I've really enjoyed the comments. And I'll be around for another half hour, but please, thank you. Go ahead. Yes.
Who was actually talking about it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
Katie, you were not on the paper, but Grace Monroy was.
Oh, okay. I was like, that sounds kind of like.
I didn't
remember that, but that's why I remembered it. But so we had one from around the same time also that had like similar, like compatible set of findings, what you just described. So